this land and locality in which we live, move and breathe is the historical traditional lands of the indigenous peoples of what we call Turtle Island and what is commonly called North America. As we journey together, may we seek the path of justice, reconciliation, and renewal. May we commit ourselves to be partners in healing and peace to the glory and thanksgiving of God, our Creator. This is a Black Anglicans of Canada declaration. We as people of African descent are commissioned and called to be ambassadors of reconciliation. We are called to create opportunities and space for courage building, healing, fellowship, and empowerment. This special calling is both a reminder and a challenge to ourselves and to the whole church that we are no longer destined to just obey, suffer, and witness, but to disrupt, heal, and lead. Our vision and our mission, and I'll quickly run through them. We envision the Anglican Church of Canada as a faith community that values and respects the rich diversity of Black people who are empowered to enjoy equitable participation, representation, and a sense of belongingness, inclusion in the mission of Jesus Christ and in the full life of the Anglican Church. Our mission is to increase the participation, representation, empowerment, and belongingness of Black people in lay and ordained leadership roles in the full life of the Anglican Church of Canada, and to develop partnerships with Black communities, other racialized groups, and oppressed peoples.
No.
These are our goals. I will not read them for you. And that's, we're going a little more in depth in belongingness, participation, empowerment, and representation. I think this is worthwhile. I have to read this quickly. Black is a designation used for people with Black African descent, including those of Afro-Caribbean and Afro-American ancestry, and those of other African roots. General membership is open to Black people who worship, work, serve, study, or volunteer in the Anglican Church community in the past, present, or those who aspire to be part of the Anglican community or support the stated mission and vision of Black Anglicans of Canada. We also have ally membership. Allies membership is open to internal and external allies who support the stated vision and mission of Black Anglicans of Canada and who are not eligible for general membership. This is the leadership team, the two co-chairs, Jacqueline Daly and Lance Wilson, Anita Gittins, Brother Reginald Crenshaw, myself in finance, Vernon Savage, and Yvonne Murray and Dolores Lawrence, and our patron, Bishop Peter Fenty. It is my pleasure now to welcome the Reverend Denise Gillard, President of My Divine Appointment, Coaching and Consulting. And she will speak to the topic of Canadian Black Church history, early seeds of anti-Black racism. But let me first give you a little background on Reverend Denise. Reverend Denise Gillard is an authentic collaborative leadership, defines her, and exemplifies her. She's aware of many hats. She's a senior leader of Denise Gillard Ministries, an organization investing in the spiritual development, equipping, and mobilization of leaders. The founder and executive artistic director of the HopeWorks Connection, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to empowering youth in the performing arts, academics, and relieving poverty. And the senior pastor at Kingdom City Church in the great GTA. In all that she does, Reverend Denise is intentional about helping people reach beyond their perceived limitations in exchange for taking hold of God's abundance. Born in Oakville, Ontario, Reverend Denise witnessed firsthand our resourcefulness, entrepreneurial ambition, and motivation to provide for family and create opportunity and change in the community from her father, a business owner and Jamaican immigrant to Canada, and her mother, a community activist from Nova Scotia. She received her undergraduate degree at Tyndale Bible College and Seminary in Toronto School of Theology, and her postgraduate degree from Divinity College of McMaster University, Hamilton. She was first ordained with the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec. Reverend Denny's collaborative approach to community work and ministries has afforded her the opportunity to mentor up and coming as well as established community leaders and ministers. She has been a featured speaker, panelist, and writer nationally and internationally. Reverend Denise is mother to 3 grown children and grandmother to a 6-year-old fireball granddaughter. The apple of her eye, and I know that, along with her husband, Wilton, a youngest daughter. Reverend Denise lives in the best part of Toronto, and well, no guess, known to some as Scarborough. Reverend Denise has won several distinguished awards, including the African Canadian Women's Achievement Award for Excellence in Youth and Women's Development, and the African Canadian Achievement Award for Excellence in Religion. In 2013, she graduated from ARA Leadership Executive Stream and worked through the World Vision sponsored certification in nonprofit management. She's also an award-winning author and songwriter and much, much more. Her greatest achievements, however, are found in the success of the young people she serves, the church she leads, and the adults she coaches as they seek to live out God's calling, purpose, and destiny for their lives. And this is just a small caps of Reverend Denise, my dear friend. And I will now hand over to you, Denise.
Thank you. First of all, I didn't write that bio, so forgive me the wording. And thank you so much to a couple of friends who have said hello. It's so nice to see, and chats from people that I haven't gotten to see for a while. I am so honored to be here this evening and trying to figure out how to, keep it in the pocket, because we want to dialogue a bit. We are talking about Canadian Black church history, early seeds of anti-Black racism. And in order to do that, I do need to locate myself. As Vernal had said, Reverend Vernal, my father is Jamaican. He's passed away now, but he came to Canada when he was 13. And on my mother's side of the family, I see that some Scotians on the line. We're from Nova Scotia, and my family is 11th generation Canadian. As you heard, I was born in Oakville, which was at the time suburbia heaven. So I grew up as, we were one of maybe 3 Black families in Oakville, and we were all related in some way. If they weren't related by blood, they were related by marriage. And so I grew up as being the one, the only, the first, until my sister came. And then there was the 2. And then my brother came, there was the 3. It wasn't until my brother, and we're all like 2 years apart, that people from other countries and backgrounds really began to come to Oakville. So we experienced the true Canadian experience at that time of being alone. 23 years ago, when I went to McMaster, study for my MDiv, I wanted to specialize in Black church Christian history. That was what I thought I would be doing with my life. And I began that with such intent and such drive, and later on got to go to Toronto School of Theology, where we met, Vernal, and I think that's where Jacqueline and I met before that, but several people that are part of this, that's where we met. And again, wanting to pursue that. But it was at the time where many Black youth were starting to, we called it the Summer of Guns, and around that time where Black youth were beginning to shoot each other and different things were happening in the community, I started an organization, and I couldn't balance study of history and this work in the community. So I literally had to choose. Black church Canadian history is still my love. I watch as other people write, and I do work on reparations and things on the side, and I still, dream of that day. But I'm getting older, I don't know. So I just keep doing it on the side as a historian. And so what I want to say tonight in that context, is as Black people, we understand ourselves as a spiritual people wherever we are in the world. And when I looked back at that thesis of that paper to prepare for tonight, I realized that thesis remains unchanged. That thesis went something like this: the Black Christian religious experience in Canada has evolved in an environment dominated by racism and classism and sexism. And due to these isms, for the most part, wherever Christian nurture has taken root among communities of Black people in Canada, Black church has found it necessary to separate from the mainstream in order to afford its members the full participation, lay empowerment, leadership development, and spiritual dignity essential to those who would unite as the body of Christ. I thought about that thesis in the context of the denomination that I serve in, and it's not a Black denomination. In the context of, sharing with you in this platform as Black Anglicans, why do I still believe that? And it's because of our history that, to some degree, because the early seeds of anti-Black racism are so strongly embedded in the church, there always needs to be a movement of stepping out to stay in. Stepping out to stay in. And I'm not sure. I listened to your mission and vision, and I'm like, very interesting. There's several things when you're looking at Black church history that are important to know, because I'm hoping there's other historians on the line, or, my dream is that we're all historians. Number one, primary material, source material on our history as Black Christians is not easy to find in Canada, because our history has been undervalued and devalued. And so they didn't keep the paperwork, or things were not cherished, or things were destroyed. Even burial grounds. We often see movies where First Nations or Aboriginal people's grounds are disrespected. Well, the Black burial grounds in Canada have gone through that same experience. Secondly, the historical vision of Canada is usually disseminated in terms of English culture and French culture. And the Canadian society often only thinks of Black folk as new immigrants, or, they're always thinking about the newer immigration. And up to 2016, Black folk were always less than 2% of the population. In 2016, that raised to 3.5% of the population. Then we also have to remember that early expressions of Black Canadian history, whether church history or not, were through the lens of people who saw our history from their own perspective. And so it's been always hard to gather up the information, especially when it comes to church history. And so tonight, I just want to kind of boot camp us through important things to consider when thinking about early seeds of anti-Black racism and the church. So if we think of Canadian history, we need to think of major themes. So the major themes that I would bring would be the French regime, the British regime, and Canada West, the Canadian West. And we can look to describe the Black Christian experience in these contexts. And we could identify common themes, and then we can think about what's going on in the church today and how seeds were planted. So first of all, I want us to think about New France, that French regime. The colony of New France was Roman Catholic. We need to, because we're thinking about the church. And the Catholic Church did not oppose or speak out against slavery. Secular priests, religious communities that included some of our favorites, maybe like the Jesuits, Dominicans, the Franciscans, you know, St. Francis. I always love making a channel of your peace. The Franciscans, Ursulines in Louisiana, which had a diocese in Quebec, Brothers of Charity at Louisbourg, Benevolent Mother Marie de Yeoville, who ran the General Hospital, all had slaves. That's very important when we think about it. And then when we think about authors who wrote, where we might get secondary information, like some of the older historians, like Winks would call their slavery humane and family-like. You know, in other words, the slaves were given names that were family names. So that makes it humane and family-like. Slaves were allowed to be baptized. And upon being baptized, that's when they got those family names and they could carry their master's names. And so this was thought or postured as a nice Christian Catholic type of slavery. Slavery is slavery, and it worked itself out in the church. So for instance, all children born in slave marriages belonged to the mother's master. And the slaves, by the way, were Black or Pawnee, which was a First Nations kind of mix. And most notably, Black folk were not allowed to be ordained or take holy orders or become priests. So there was a Christian endorsement of a brand of slavery that, while you know, some historians might have said sounded nicer and gentler because they were part of the family, what that did, it made it so that any kind of Black religious fervor in Catholicism in Canada was effectively smothered. There was no self-direction, because imagine you could go to a certain services, of course, be at the back. You could do certain things, but you weren't allowed in any way to experience any form of leadership or education. So if we look at our history, there is no self-expression of Black Christian Catholic religion in Canadian history because of this smothering. So that's the French regime, really quick. As I said, boot camping, trying to be respectful of the time, and reminding the people on the other end, I am a preacher and pastor too. So you know, don't forget to chat me and give me my timing, because my phone with my timer ran out. Let's talk about the British regime. So when we think about the British regime, we would think about the time of 1713, when the French territory of Acadia was handed over to the British in the Treaty of Utrecht. The slave trade was brisk among Church of England ministers, among government officials, among merchants, most notably those British merchants that dealt in Quebec. And remember, Detroit was a part of Canada. Everybody knows that, right? So the British, having taken Detroit from the French in 1760. And I want us to kind of zero in on the Loyalist movement. Now, you heard that on my mother's side, I'm Nova Scotian. So I am a product of this era in that my grandmother's people were slaves. My grandfather's people were freemen. My grandmother's people were slaves and intermarried with First Nations people. So during the Loyalist movement, the British government that had been weighed down by debt, and they began a program of taxation and tax reforms so they could get back the money that they lost during the 7 Years' War. And they began to tax those subjects in what is now the US. And they weren't having it. All of us have heard about things like the Boston Tea Party. They were not having this taxation. And so, of course, war ensued as things went on. And the Loyalists were those what we would call Americans who fought on the British side. They agreed with the British. They wanted to stay connected to the motherland of England and Great Britain. And so during the war, they were promised certain things, and they were promised land if they fought on the side of the British. And that land was promised in the Caribbean. It was promised in Nova Scotia. And British were very wise. They had their, wise. They have it down to a T, the divide and conquer strategy against the Americans. So they offered freedom to any rebel slaves who would join their ranks. And so on the boats, when the time came for the promised land to be given in 1783, on those boats coming to Canada from the States, because they lost the war, was people who were freemen, it's my grandfather's people, and people who were still slaves, and of loyalists who came. So imagine white loyalists with black slaves, black freemen coming to Canada, get this promised land. Now the loyalists, the black loyalists, were told they could go to the West Indies, they could go to other British territories, but wisely, most of them chose Canada because they didn't want to go to the Caribbean where there was still slavery, because they had fears of just being enslaved. James Walker, a historian, he estimated that including free and enslaved blacks who came to Nova Scotia, there was about 3,550 men, women, and children. Those who came, they were distributed throughout the Maritimes, especially to St. John, New Brunswick, Shelburne, Nova Scotia, with a few going to PEI. Most importantly, there was a free black settlement in Nova Scotia named Birchtown, very important. It was named after Colonel Samuel Birch. And I want to play you a clip from a documentary, and I'm going to put, at the end, I'm going to put the link. You could watch this whole documentary if you'd like to. Seeking Salvation, you'll see a younger, bit chubbier me as part of the video. I'm going to share screen, and I just want you to get that sense of what these people came to, what our people came to, and you'll see how racism worked itself out. So I'm going to get that up for you, and I'm going to make sure we share the sound. Oh, excellent. And let me just get it to play here. Where is it? Oh, goodness. 1 second. Had it there. Sometimes when you, oh, there we go. Seeking Salvation clip.
It was such a difference. And so even then, we were facing institutional and systemic.
Just want to make sure you're seeing and hearing okay?
Yes.
Good.
Systemic racism.
Nobody had to legislate segregation in Nova Scotia or again New Brunswick or Prince Edward Island because it was set up by the settlement patterns. White town, black village.
Far enough out of town that they wouldn't disrupt the social life of the white people, but close enough so they could come into work.
And so you had a situation set up of economic dependency, but also racial separateness that contributed to a sense of distinctiveness because you did have your own community. Even if the land was rocky, stony, boggy, marshy, impossible to farm, it was yours.
They were skilled laborers. In some cases, they were better at doing the different jobs than the general community was. As a result, there was a riot that took place in 1784 in Shelburne by the white disbanded soldiers who were so upset that the black men were getting the jobs that the white men weren't. And so they actually invaded the black community.
This first race riot was, in fact, a white riot against the black settlers that led to an interest in developing separate infrastructure. And of course, that led to the creation of various church movements, chapel movements, and so on.
They were not given any kind of elevation in the church. You could only be part of the congregation. You would never be allowed to become an elder. or a deacon or, God forbid, a minister.
As more and more loyalists came, some with blacks who were slaved, so you had slaves and then you had free blacks, they began to push the blacks to the back of the church.
There was areas where they were only allowed to sit in certain pews. They weren't allowed to sit near the pulpits.
Until the point where the white settlers couldn't stand to look at the black folk, and they put them up in the balconies.
In St. Paul's Church in Halifax, for example, the balcony was referred to as the slave pews, because slave Christians sat up there before there were any free blacks coming in.
And they were referred to quite blatant and racist as nigger heaven or nigger pews.
When they didn't want that anymore, they put a curtain to block them from their view. And at that point, many of the black Christians chose to meet in their own homes or meeting houses, still under the supervision of the Anglican Church.
Most of the Anglican clergymen would appoint a black person to be a lay reader. There was a man named Joseph Leonard who was appointed to be such a lay reader in a black community called Brindleytown near Digby. And the Bishop Inglis of Nova Scotia, he went on his annual visitation, I guess, to confirm children and to perform the various offices that were required for a bishop. And he discovered that Joseph Leonard was doing everything that in normal circumstances a priest of the Anglican Church did. He was burying, he was marrying, he was doing communion, he was doing all the things that you had to be a priest to do. And so I'm getting this story from Bishop Inglis's own diary. He says, I admonished Leonard and told him that he wasn't supposed to be doing these things. It wasn't allowed. Whereupon, according to the bishop, Leonard replied, if that's the situation, then we wish to have a church of our own. We wish to have an independent church.
Okay, there you go. Making sure we go here. There you are. Thank you. So as you can see from that little clip from the video, and please do remind me, I'm happy to put the link to the whole documentary. It's called Seeking Salvation. It's about the Black church experience in Canada. As you had could see from the experience that when Black folk came to Nova Scotia en masse, they were put into their different communities, and they were primarily, if they were Christian, they were all Anglican, and the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, dominated Nova Scotia. And you could see through a exclusion, ended up leaving many and forming their own churches. Well, we're at 20 minutes, so there is just so much to talk about. I would be remiss if I didn't talk quickly about Canada West. Canada West, when you look at that theme, is really talking about Ontario and on, right? That's where we are now. So what do I want to say quickly about Ontario West and the Black Christian experience? I want to say that around 1791, when reformer William Wilberforce introduced the bill to stop the importation of slaves into the British colony, that was the same year that one of his supporters, Colonel John Graves Simcoe, became the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, where we are, Ontario. You think of the town of Simcoe, and we think of Emancipation Day, and Emancipation Day formally was called Lord Simcoe Day, right? Or I think there's still some overlap. I just forget, push that one out and think about Emancipation Day. At that time, the emancipation of slaves was not purely motivated because Christians felt convicted of their sin. It was economic reasons, really a lot of economic reasons before this, behind this, because they didn't need the kind of labor that they had needed in the pioneering days. And so they began to set free their slaves, just set them free, but with no provision. And they began to, after being set free, find them to be a nuisance. It was a problem. These were very, very poor people. You set people free and you set them free. Oh, you're free. You have nothing. So they saw them as a nuisance, and there was a lot of financial reasons, and of course there was a lot of good folk who were really trying to help the communities of people that were set free. Then there was also a sense in which there were slaves that were running to the promised land of Canada. So they were coming here and they were known as fugitive slaves. And if you think of the Amherstburg and Windsor area via the Underground Railroad, while they were running this way, you know that Black folk were running back to the States as well because life here was so hard. So there was this whole fugitive community of Black folk who were Christian. And when they started attending the churches, well, the white churches became quite annoyed at this large influx of poor people. And as they reached freedom, you see, what fugitives did was they gathered in places like under trees and different, and the first thing they did was they began to worship God. And then they tried to join different churches. Blacks were only accepted into white churches in Canadian history on very unequal terms. Many I can never say that word, many kind gestures of good white Christian failed due to poor management, corruption, or tightly held paternalistic views of Black folk. So it was either that, you know, we need to tell you what to do or tell you how to do it, or we understand things better than you do, or we just don't want you in your church. So go and start in our church. So go and start your own church, and all kinds of, you know, it would take much longer than the time we have today to talk about it, but there came quite a, I want to talk about a separatist move, although there was some cornerstones of the community where religious institutes ministered to the spiritual need, performed social and educational functions, and supplied most of the administrators that the community had. Religion, Christian faith was fundamental to the Black experience. In slavery, it was only a consolation. In freedom, it inspired exaltation, gratitude, and hidden seeds of leadership development. People began to take separate paths. So an example of a separate path would be the Amherstburg Regular Baptist Association, founded in October of 1841, and it was an association of Black and Black churches that worked together with congregational polity to find an expression that established a model that was based on both their British and American counterparts. Because theories were put forward in the white church, theories like, oh, they need to worship separately because they want a more exuberant worship. And they have different social concerns. These associations tended to join with the white association rather than be a source of edification and support. It was about setting policies and governance and decisions, and the seeds of that are still showing, by the way, in both Baptist and Methodist denominations. To promote unity amongst Black Baptists, to exchange ideas, to meet the religious needs of Blacks that have been ignored by white church associations and congregations for years. Black folk began to rise up and establish separate associations that would work in partnership, at least on paper, with white denomination. So when one thinks about the early seeds of racism in Black church history, there's some themes that we can explore. One is Egypt, the idea of Egypt. Black people in Canada are in the early days of Canada, are the only group of people who were stolen in North America. We're the only ones, and to be used for menial labor that was unpaid. Most of the first Blacks in Canada experienced a status far below indentured labor or servant, or a lot of immigrants that went through hard times, such as the Chinese and the Irish and church experience was always one of being pushed away, covered up, controlled, or separating. And so when we think about this, when we look at our experience as Black Christians, the motif of Egypt is something we could use as a call to account, empower, facilitate the mission of the church as a whole. Another theme I think worth exploring when we look at early seeds is that of Exodus and diaspora. And the Canadian Black church experience, both of those are related. The sense of leaving to go somewhere else, yet never truly being at home, weaves in and out of the historical experience of Blacks in Canada, particularly Christian Blacks, because the conditions in which we were called to live were structured within powerful relationships and institutions that put their will upon people. On one hand, we don't want you to worship in the pews with us. We're going to put you up. But on the other hand, we don't want you to have your own churches. Exodus and diaspora. I think another theme worth exploring is that of the Promised Land. It's a myth. It's a popular myth that Canada, it's better in Canada. It's better to be in Canada than the States. Canada is the Promised Land. And yet our history shows people coming and leaving at the same time. Those Blacks who are Indigenous, having lived here for several generations, those who have immigrated from the Caribbean, those who have immigrated from Africa, from the motherland, at one time or another, all of these people have seen Canada as a sort of promised land. But the role of Black Christian historians will have to be to document both the realization of this promised land and the failure of the motif in order to expose its potential as a gift and or document the realizations and failures. Ultimately, the history of the Black church shows that there is a sense in which Black folk in Christian experience had to move slightly out to become central what's happening on the inside. Thank you so much for having me. I hope this was helpful. I look forward to dialoguing. I know it's a lot because how do you talk about history in 25 minutes? I stuck to my time, yay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend Denise. You have whet our appetite. Let us jump into the questions because I know the time can move so quickly and there's so much to share. The first question I have here is, unless I am naive, the church was intended to build a comfort zone for everyone. So tell me, why then, still in the year 2020, we feel the need for a Black Anglican group within the Anglican Church?
Well, that's a very exciting question. How can we judge when our ministry and our mission is working? Different people have different ways of judging that. This is what I look for. When young Black people, let's even take out Black, when young people of all backgrounds hear the call of God on their life, when we are reproducing leaders, and I want to use the word leaders, of all backgrounds. So the question the church must ask is, are we en masse producing leaders of all backgrounds? And even furthermore, are we producing leaders, Black leaders? Can a young Black person sitting in our Anglican pews clearly en masse hear the call of God on their life? You can answer that yourself. My answer is no, they're not. They are not. Someone could say, well, many others are not. I'm concerned about all young people. As you tell my bio, it's a passion. So we, in Canadian experience, in order for Black Christians to flourish, and this might be a bit provocative, there has always historically, as you can see from the little bit that I shared, there's always been a need to come apart to be in. And the only place that didn't do that was in New France, and there's no Black Catholic expression. In the other regions, historically, was always a come out to be a part of, and then there was an authentic experience. I hope that helps people think about the answer. I might not have answered it.
Thank you, that is, at least you're pointing us in the right direction. Thank you. The other one is, a question of resources. What are the best resources for dismantling racism workshops dealing with the Canadian Black Christian experience? We want to incorporate this significant story in the Diocesan Racism Awareness Workshop. Am I reading the right? Yes.
I'm not quite.
What are the best resources for dismantling racism? Somebody wants to create a workshop to enable that.
So they want to create a workshop.
Yes, and this is coming from the Diocese of New Westminster.
So I personally believe that, I love history, which means I love stories. So I personally believe that once people know their story and take responsibility for their story, that powerful things can be dismantled. So for instance, as Anglicans, knowing that this is an Anglican gathering, I believe it's important for Anglicans to understand the Anglican Church's role in anti-Black racism. The place to look for that is the history of Nova Scotia. Of course, because today I just had to boot camp through. There's a lot there. And once people know the story, admit the story, it's easier to dismantle the outcomes of that story. So for instance, you could come back again to, well, that might be the very answer to the first question, right? What are we doing, or what is the Anglican Church doing to empower Black Christian leadership? What are the barriers, the historical barriers within the context of the church? And once you know what they are, then strategies to dismantle become, I think, a little more obvious and helpful.
Okay. There were a couple other statements, but let me read out this one. Even when French were in New France, since the governor was allowed to own slaves, the rich, which included clergy, asked for the same, included the archbishop and bishops of the Presbyterian and Anglican churches predating the HR.
So I think, if I'm understanding, it doesn't sound like a question, it sounds like a statement, which I can affirm. Religious leaders across all of the major mainstream institutionalized powerful denominations were slaveholders. Let's just say that. The church did not differentiate itself. Now, for some of the newer movements, and maybe I want to say newer to Canada, because, for instance, my father was Anglican. I was born and raised Baptist, so, Baptist ministers in the States in particular held slaves. Canada had a different experience, right? So if they weren't slaveholders, my dear, they perpetuated racist structures, because in the end, it came down to black and white. Now, in the midst of that, there was always, of all denominations, amazing Christian people, white Christians who had a different perspective, who understood gospel differently. There's always been those folk, not just the Quakers, always been those folk. They were a minority. The most prominent voices, the most wealthy voices, those who were in positions of power in the government, were either slaveholders or endorsed slaveholding, until it became economically unsuitable in the Canadian context.
Okay. All right, let me rush to the next question. Why do you think the church as a whole struggles with acknowledging their role in oppressing the Black community, and ministers not willing to address it in their sermons? Most leadership in churches, unless there are black churches, in quotes, do not have black leadership. What next steps should be taken by the church to change that?
Wow, that's a big question, especially
Yes,
as a
yes.
pastor. You know, it's a question that's dear to my heart. Why, you know, so to narrow the question, what I'm hearing is it's not just the church, but it makes us more sad, right? Why is it that structures, powers, institution, pastors are just afraid to admit anti-Black racism?
Yeah.
What that I ask God that question all the time, and I think because it's so ingrained in the fabric. Can I just be North American for a moment? Of
Sure.
North America, Canada likes to say United States is the bad guy. North America was built on the backs of slave labor, enslaved. I don't even like to say slave. It's enslaved people's labor. It was built. And Canada says, oh, well, we didn't have a lot of slavery, but the money, just think about it. Those people that came as loyalists, where was their money from? It was from slave labor, which they brought with them to Canada, and they brought those ideologies. And I think my biggest thought on this answer is fear. Because if you admit something, then you have to quit it. You have to change. You have to, one of the passions that I have is the push, the demand for reparations. Here, reparations, everybody thinks of money only, and it's much more than money. Should be afraid because it's bigger than money, right?
Absolutely.
So I think it's fear. And then when we think about what the church can do, well, Black Christians, well, this Lord help me, Jesus, we need to hold ourselves accountable, because most times we're afraid to say anything or to say Black, and mostly we suffer in silence in multicultural congregations where we are still used to do all the work of the church, but not often let at the leadership table. So, sorry if I sound a little troublesome. I do believe there's a role for the troublers of Israel. I'm a Black female, 11th generation Canadian pastor with enough education, and I still face those barriers and boundaries that want to keep me from reaching my full potential in Jesus Christ. But, it's open heavens over the Black community, another different topic. Go for it. It starts with us as individuals and us in our church, wanting to be at the leadership table, believing we're good enough, taking up our positions, making demands in love and speaking the truth in love.
Okay. Thank you. There's always good trouble. Yes, man. Congressman Lewis spoke to that, and part of our problem is the comfortable pew. Let us move on to something else. The ABCs of Black Anglicans, our dream back in 1996, advocacy to bring the concerns of the Black community to the attention of the authorities at all levels within the church, and exert every effort to eradicate every vestige of racism within the Anglican Church of Canada. B, the building capacity to foster vocations in the Black community, provide information about Black people and their involvement in the life of church, and a forum to discuss issues that impact the Black community. Or to create and celebrate forms of worship sensitive to our culture, heritage, and so on, and liturgical expression. And then the third thing is Canon Stevens shared was that the one was community, support Black clergy and laity, provide opportunities for young Black Anglicans to meet in a safe and non-threatening environment, and a supportive network for parishes and so on. I'm happy Canon Stephen put this in the chat area. I'm going to move to the next question. One of the 5 marks of mission is to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and pursue peace and reconciliation. Has the church been living up to this expectation, considering the seed of racism that has been planted in the system?
If that was a question for me, can you say that one more time?
One of the 5 marks of mission. In the Anglican Church, we have 5 marks of mission. And one of those is to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and pursue peace and reconciliation. Has the church been living up to this expectation, considering the seed of racism that has been planted in the system? I know it's a kind of obvious no.
No.
But I invite you to.
No. The answer is no, and we need to repent. We need to do better. And I noticed that I took a quick look at the chat. Maybe that's why I was a bit distracted, and saw a little bit of a conversation about why do we have to educate other folk, white folk, and why do we have to do this? And I totally agree. It's not my job to educate white folk or any other folk. It is my job to take my place. So coming back to what you're saying, Bruno, I think that the answer is no. And as Black folk, we need to take our place. Take our places at the leadership table. We need to express, and we need to not allow our voices to be silenced, because Canadian racism, I mean, I've been working and talking with youth a lot. It's almost intangible. You can't prove it. It feels like you can't put your finger on it. You can't. It was described as arsenic and slow poisoning. And I work with young Black folk, and many of them live and move and have no being because they feel this sense of oppression, but they can't put words to it, can't prove it, can't. Well, the church is armed with the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit cannot be contained, goes wherever Holy Spirit wants to go, all of those things. And I believe that Holy Spirit force and power, when we embrace that, doesn't matter what denomination we're in or what have you, we have the wind beneath our wings to take our place, to make our demands, to love, to call people to account. It's dynamic. And so the seeds of racism in Black Christian experience in Canada are deeply planted, deeply rooted, and must be dug up. They must be dug up. That's all, they must be. We must never relent and never surrender. And we do that with love and joy. I just love people. Because I love people, I call people to account because I love them. That's not what God has for them. It must be a torture. I don't know how you do it. It takes up too much energy. It's like not forgiving. Now, forgiveness is a process. We have to forgive, right? So digging up roots of racism and taking our place is a process, but we must do it.
Okay, I'm going to throw in one more question because I want to stop with now. If you were advising the bishops across Canada concerning, I suspect they meant racism, what would you suggest they do tomorrow to begin the journey toward dismantling anti-Black racism in their jurisdictions?
Ooh,
that's a big question, I know.
But I would believe that, first of all, every leader needs to look for the racism in their own selves. Because racism, it's invisible. It's an invisible lens by which they do and function, and and they can justify. Like Christians, we're good at justifying things. Like we could say, oh, because of their accent, we can't promote, or oh, because of they don't have enough experience. And so what I would say to every bishop across Canada, and I'm not talking about anti-racism classes and all of those things, which could be helpful, but can we just and they just confront their own inner racists. I believe that's one of the fearful points for ministers. Somebody had said something earlier about, pastors and ministers. I believe that many pastors and ministers they're afraid of their own hidden racism because it's very ugly. And to see ourselves through lenses that are ugly, like it's very difficult. But I think that's the place to start.
Okay. Thank you so much, Reverend Denise. And we are scratching the surface. We don't have enough time, but I want to thank you for making the time to present this historical side of things in terms of Canada. Sometimes people have wrong ideas that only the South is a problem when we have a different kind of permutation here of racism that is endemic and horrible. And I'm hoping that with this journey of anti-Black racism, we will get there. Thank you, Reverend Denise.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I will now invite Karine from Black Lives Matter to come on board. Karine? We're doing these roundtable for August with Black Lives Matter Canada. And I'm inviting Karine as one of the leaders for Black Lives. I understand she's on board.
Yes, she's right there.
Karine? Oh, good afternoon, Karine. So, well,
That is perfectly okay. So thank you. Yes, I'm Karine DeVerlis. I'm representative for Black Lives Matter, the Toronto chapter. I tend to be long-winded, so I'll try my best.
Yeah, 1 minute.
Yes, I'll try my best to keep it short. But so on behalf of the team, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude onto all of you and Reverend Jacqueline for your continued support. The work that BLM does is not easy, but it is necessary. So for those of you who may not be completely familiar with Black Lives Matter, we're an organization completely supported through donations. And so because of support such as yours, we are able to operate, provide support to the Black community in numerous ways, fund demonstration resources, direct support for families of victims of violence, and other organizing expenses.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So recently, an example of this is we were able to create a COVID-19 Black Emergency Support Fund to help individuals and families financially affected by COVID-19. So all donations are for the Toronto chapter, specifically to help communities within the GTA. I just wanted to say that everything that's going on, it gained traction very quickly in terms of media and just public support. And so I think it's important to say that this isn't just a moment. This is not just an event. It is a whole movement that you must be committed to realistically. And right now, you're demonstrating that to yourself. As Black people, we don't have the option to be separate from our Blackness. We can try all we want in order to separate in whatever we want. We can be successful, we can be rich, we can be kind, we can be famous, we can do all the right things, but our Blackness will always come first. And don't get me wrong, I personally love being Black. That's not the problem. The problem is how society refuses to accept Blackness and devalues Black people. And so it's important that similar to our Blackness being a lifelong thing, that your commitment to this movement follows suit. It's certainly not an easy process, the whole learning and unlearning process, and it is very uncomfortable to come to terms and to come to realization of the many ways that you may have and may continue to contribute to anti-Black racism and hate in general, but your willingness to be here and have these conversations is a commitment to Black lives in general. So yesterday I talked to Reverend Jacqueline, which was one of the warmest conversations I've ever had with a stranger, which I'm grateful for. And we kept coming back to the commandment, love thy neighbor, which got me thinking heavily, and this is what always has been on my mind. So if God is love, then our hearts must fully be separate from hate. You would think to love would be the easiest commandment to follow, but what we see through the way society operates is that so many people find a sense of comfort and ease by operating in hate, and that is the unfortunate reality. Black people are hated, but you're constantly pushed down, belittled, hurt, cast aside, uncared for, and murdered. Organizations like Black Lives Matter, through their purpose, fight against this hate with love. And many people, in order to discredit movements like this, will try to say the opposite. But Black Lives Matter is a purpose of love. And yes, it may be our rage and our pain that has pushed us and continues to push us to fight to be seen within this world, but be a reminder that love is not a direct substitute for emotions. You can love in your anger and fear just as much as you can love in your joy. It is within love that we are able to march forward. For in love, we are able to find community. It's in love that we are able to find a sense of peace. For love is the only weapon that can be used against hate. And it is in love that we find and will find liberation and peace. So through your support in the form of donations, occupancy of spaces like this to hold these conversations, you are ultimately saying that you do love us. You are saying that you love your neighbor. You are saying that you love Black people, Black lives, and you value Black lives. And you're saying that Black lives do matter. So once again, thank you for your support and allowing me this space to personally thank you on behalf of the team. I do wish you all the best on your own individual personal learning and unlearning journeys. And I just hope and pray that we may continue to find solidarity in whatever trying times we may face. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Karine. Thank you. Stephen, I'll invite you to put up the other two. Stephen, the other two slides, please. Yes, the donations. Thank you.
Toronto chapter, not Canada. Thank you, Corinne, for correcting.
Toronto chapter. Okay, so Black Lives Matter Canada, you can donate via check, e-transfer, or PayPal. Send it to donate@blacklivesmatter.ca using the password all Black Lives Matter. Send checks payable to Black Lives Matter, Toronto, 76 Geary Avenue, and the rest of the information. Thank you so much, everyone, for your support. And we will have an entire month of roundtable conversation of anti-Black racism for the Canadian context. And next week, we will have the impact of anti-Black racism in education, and the speaker in Ontario. And the speaker is Jackie Getfield. She's a PhD candidate and college professor. And I invite you all to come out to engage Jackie at that time. Thank you all for coming out this evening, and we appreciate your support in this journey to wholeness. Blessings, everyone.